Welcome, everyone. I'm Mian. I'm a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security, and one of the co-founders of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. I'm pleased to welcome you today to our webinar, Understanding the New Nuclear Arms Race, Views from Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The seminar aims to contribute to the discussions within the physics community and beyond on the threats posed by nuclear weapons. And this is part of the ongoing efforts by the coalition to inform, educate, and mobilize the physics community to take up the question of the danger of nuclear weapons in the present day. We provide information, education, opportunities for advocacy and participation in the policy process, and for next generation scientists through our Next Generation Fellows program to learn more about nuclear weapons. Today's webinar aims to introduce to everyone a discussion about the nuclear weapons, nuclear doctrines, motivations driving the arms race between the United States, Russia, and China, and provide an understanding of where we are and where we're going in this arms race in the 21st century. So our three speakers will take up in the order of their presentations the politics and policies driving the arms race in the United States, Russia, and China. So with that, let me hand over to our first speaker, who is Professor Sharon Weiner from American University School of International Service, and also a member of the Princeton University program on science and global security, to talk about the Washington perspective on this arms race that is in play. So let me hand it over to Sharon. Sharon, please.
Thanks very much. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Before I get started, let me just say that my comments here today are mine alone. They don't necessarily reflect any of the organizations that I'm associated with. Let me also say that when I'm going to talk about the view from Washington, I can talk about the politics of how these things are seen in political narratives and conversation, but I'm also going to talk about the underlying bureaucratic and process structure that actually supports this politics and has made it actually pretty consistent over time. And so I'm hoping that this will be helpful. But to set the stage, let me just outline the U.S. modernization program, which is pretty easy to do because it's basically nearly every aspect of the nuclear arsenal. So there's a new ICBM, a new nuclear-capable bomber, the Raider, new nuclear submarines, upgrades or replacements on all warheads, and really a near complete revitalization of the infrastructure for producing warheads, including plans to, again, begin enriching uranium. I mean, the U.S. stopped making HEU for weapons in 1964. They stopped making very highly enriched uranium for naval reactors in the early 90s. And in 2001, they stopped enriching altogether for nuclear weapons purposes. But the U.S. is about to get in this business again. And so part of the modernization effort is to literally modernize, refurbish, replace everything that you would need if you chose to make nuclear weapons again in the future. So that's currently in place. And it's tempting to say that all of this modernization is actually a consequence of Russia's modernization or China's increasing nuclear arsenal, but that's actually not the case. I mean, if you think back just chronologically, the modernization effort began under Obama before some of these things took place. But what I'd like to do is outline some of the bureaucratic and political imperatives that mean that it's convenient to point to Russia and China and say, this is why we're modernizing. But in fact, I think the modernization and the changes in strategy and doctrine that we are likely to see would have happened regardless of what Russia or China is doing. I think it's a convenient excuse, not an underlying driving force. So one of the things to keep in mind is that there has been strong bipartisan consensus that nuclear weapons provide security through deterrence. There's been a strong consensus among this in the United States. It's one of the few remaining places of bipartisan consensus left in politics these days. But deterrence itself provides a number of problematic contradictions. So these are things that are inconsistent or that work at cross purposes. And they create some of the dynamics we're seeing today in the back and forth between the US, Russia, China, and especially in what the US is doing. So I'm going to talk today about two of these contradictions in particular. So one is the notion that when you're trying to provide your security through deterrence, security through deterrence requires you to be intentionally vulnerable. So if the United States isn't vulnerable to nuclear annihilation from Russia or China, and if Russia and China aren't vulnerable to nuclear annihilation from the United States, then this delicate balance of deterrence breaks down. So part of the modernization challenge is, how do you remain vulnerable without unnecessarily scaring your enemies, your adversaries, or other countries? So the reason you have to remain vulnerable is because a country that thinks that it's not vulnerable to other nuclear adversaries might be tempted to initiate a first strike. So if you're not vulnerable to your adversary, you can maybe get away with attacking them or with pursuing other types of aggression that they don't like, in the knowledge that their nuclear arsenal actually can't hurt you. So vulnerability plays a big role in trying to be invulnerable. So for example, missile defense could easily cause both Russia and China to worry that the US thinks it is no longer vulnerable to their nuclear arsenals, and that the US might use this missile defense system as a shield for aggression. Well, the second contradiction is that the things that you do to make yourself feel more secure actually make other countries feel less secure. They respond, and you become less secure in reality. So it's a spiraling competition between action and reaction in the name of your security that actually ends up making you less secure because everybody responds to what you're doing. So the US modernizes, China and Russia worry, the US worries about why they are modernizing, and everybody sees their own modernization as benign, where they see the modernization of others as unnecessarily aggressive and threatening. And I think this is one of the stories that governs the political debate about nuclear weapons and strategy and doctrine in the US today, is that whatever the US does should be excused as understood in the name of security, but what everybody else does in the name of security is threatening and unnecessary. So in the US, these contradictions are actually made worse by bureaucracies and processes that we use to create strategy, build force structure, and to plan and to budget. So for the bureaucracies involved, they do their jobs and they engage in what's called worst case scenario planning. So it's a requirement of what they're expected to do. If you're supposed to keep the United States secure, you have to keep it secure from the worst possible case. Well, of course, the worst possible case when the US plans for it looks unnecessarily aggressive to other countries. It might even look worse. A second bureaucratic issue is that consistently in the nuclear era, US nuclear strategy developed by the Pentagon has mimicked some of the assumptions of conventional military strategy. In particular, that you have to always be prepared, should deterrence fail, to go on the offensive. So what this means in terms of force structure is the US has never been satisfied with just deterrence. It always has to plan for the forces necessarily to fight and prevail in a nuclear war if deterrence fails. And of course, preparing for what to do if deterrence fails exacerbates the problems of still being vulnerable and the insecurity spiral that develops as countries arm. Another issue that comes with the bureaucracy and the political issues is that costs for nuclear modernization are actually artificially supported. So for example, there are two parts to the US nuclear weapons complex. There's the Department of Defense that makes the delivery systems, and then there's the National Nuclear Security Administration in the Department of Energy that makes the warheads that go on those delivery systems. So the Defense Department is in charge of setting the requirements for what nuclear warheads should be able to do, and they give those requirements to NNSA. But they're not responsible for funding those requirements. That's NNSA's problem. And of course, NNSA comes to political leaders and says, oh, there's, quote, a military requirement that we be able to do X, Y, or Z, so therefore you have to give us the money for this. So basically, the organization that sets the requirements doesn't have to pay for them, and the organization that has to achieve them has immediate cover because somebody authoritative with expertise set those requirements. Another way that costs are artificially supported is something called the ROSA. This is the Report on Stockpile Assessment. So every year, the directors of Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia, along with the head of Strategic Command, are required to certify the arsenal. That is, to certify to the President of the United States that the arsenal functions as intended. Well, of course, these are 4 players that all have direct equities in having more, not fewer, nuclear weapons. And in particular, the directors of the 3 labs are directors of for-profit companies. The report they give to the president is also required in law to be transmitted to Congress without alteration. So what this means is the very agencies and organizations that have a direct stake in nuclear weapons and more nuclear weapons are allowed to argue whether or not the arsenal is okay or needs improvement without alteration. And we know from past history that sometimes they have suggested that they would not make the certification and assessment if presidents of the United States engaged in certain arms control activities or other activities that they thought reduced the role and importance of the nuclear arsenal. Another thing that exacerbates this problem is cost increases and the lack of oversight over these cost increases. And most importantly, the assumption that nuclear weapons provide security through deterrence and that this is affordable at any price. But modernization efforts are never evaluated in terms of their contributions to deterrence. They're never compared to the problems they might create for deterrence, and they're never compared to the other alternatives. So, for example, when I started, I said the United States is modernizing literally every aspect of its nuclear arsenal. There was never an opportunity when parts of that modernization were considered in terms of the response they might get from Russia or China, and they were never evaluated in terms of trade-offs between part of that arsenal. Instead, the assumption is all things are necessary. So in the start of the Cold War era, when the US first had its nuclear arsenal, there was a political scientist that named Werner Schilling, who made an analysis of the very first ever Cold War defense budget. And he said, look, we're asking the military to prepare for an attack that we don't know when it will happen, we don't know who it will be from, and we don't know what it will look like. And we can have all the expertise in the world try and tell us what these things will look like, but reasonable experts will disagree about the answer. So how do you make decisions between alternatives about which reasonable experts disagree? And his answer was politics. And I would present to you today that this is still the problem and the driving force in US nuclear modernization and in US nuclear doctrines and strategy. It's not national security, it's the politics of having organizations and bureaucracies with a stake in what they're doing give advice about what they can do in a world when you can never inherently know what exactly the right answer is. So, of course, when it comes to national security, we can appreciate that bureaucratic politics, partisan politics, other issues drive national security and nuclear choices in the United States. But of course, to the Russians and the Chinese, that looks very different. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Zia. I think my 10 minutes are up.
Thank you, Sharon. Our second speaker is going to be Tong Zhao. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And he's also affiliated with the Carnegie China Center, which was in Beijing. And he's been following nuclear weapons issues in China and the Chinese internal debate for a very long time. And like Sharon, he also has an affiliation with the Princeton program on science and global security. So Tong Zhao, over to you.
Thank you so much, Zia. I really appreciate this opportunity to join this discussion. in the past decade, China's approach to nuclear weapons has changed very significantly. For decades, China had maintained a rather small nuclear arsenal of about 200 nuclear weapons. But since a few years ago, China appeared to be significantly increasing that number. So today, according to US government assessment, China has more than 500 nuclear weapons and is on path to develop 700 nuclear weapons by 2027 and 1,000 by the end of this decade. China is also deviating from its traditional reliance on land-based nuclear weapons as the backbone of its strategic deterrent. And it is currently developing a nuclear triad capability with land-based, sea-based, and air-based nuclear weapons. And China is also changing some of its traditional nuclear postures. China used to maintain a very modest nuclear posture, a very low-level alert status for nuclear weapons during the peacetime. The warheads were reportedly separated from the missiles and stored at a different location. But today, the Chinese leadership is emphasizing rapid response capability. China has put a portion of its missile forces on higher alert combat readiness level in peacetime. And China also appears developing the early warning systems with which China could potentially transition towards a launch on warning or launch under attack posture. And the Chinese government's overall narrative about nuclear weapons has also changed from a traditional emphasis on the development of a lean and effective nuclear force towards a more ambitious goal of developing a powerful strategic deterrent capability. So the question is, why is China making such changes? If you talk to Chinese government officials and nuclear policy experts, they insist that China's nuclear strategy and nuclear policy have not changed. But I think that both can be true at the same time, with China's expansion of nuclear arsenal and also the Chinese interlocutors' insistence that there is no significant nuclear policy change. So my personal understanding is the current nuclear buildup is more driven by the Chinese paramount leader, meaning Mr. Xi's personal belief that China is facing greater strategic hostility from the United States and its Western allies. And somehow he believed that if China can demonstrate stronger strategic power, and especially nuclear power, China could influence the US and Western perception of the relevant balance of power in the world. And they would be compelled to accept the reality that China has already risen to become an equally powerful country whose core interests need to be more respected. In other words, the buildup is likely to be a result of the political leaders' untested belief that a bigger nuclear arsenal could help moderate the overall American behavior towards China. And the nuclear buildup is not necessarily driven by clearly defined new nuclear strategy at the operational level. So there are a few implications if this is true. Firstly, from the Chinese perspective, its own nuclear buildup is stabilizing because China has convinced itself that it is the United States and its Western allies who are adopting an increasingly extreme and desperate measure of strategic containment against China. And these countries are increasingly interested in taking greater military risks to achieve the goal of destabilizing China and disrupting China's continuous growth in order to preserve the Western dominance in the international system. So that perception makes China think that China needs to demonstrate strategic power, and that's the most effective way to moderate Western policy and behavior towards China. And therefore, China's nuclear buildup could only lead to a more careful and more prudent and more cautious US policy on China. So as China still in the middle of a massive nuclear buildup process, there is very little political interest in Beijing to consider near-term measures to join arms control talks with the United States in the near-term future. And the Chinese leadership appears to be taking a step-by-step approach to build up China's nuclear capability. There is no evidence that Xi Jinping has decided to achieve nuclear parity with the United States or Russia. More likely, China will increase its nuclear arsenal by some numbers and will then reevaluate its security environment and makes a decision about the next step later. However, because Chinese leaders expect that greater Chinese nuclear capability and overall military capability could lead to a softer and a more accommodating US policy towards China, they do not expect that a greater Chinese nuclear arsenal would worsen the bilateral relationship. But I think the opposite of their expectation is likely to be true. The US and Western countries will develop serious, in fact, they have already developed very serious concerns about China's secretive nuclear expansion. And so the bilateral security relationship is likely to become worse as a result. And by that time, the Chinese leadership is unlikely to reflect on their previous decision and acknowledge they made a mistake. But instead, they are likely to conclude that they simply need more nuclear weapons to eventually compel the United States to accept the reality of a risen China. So although the current thinking is China may not need to develop to the same level of nuclear capability as the United States, we could still see a very serious action-reaction cycle taking place that leads to a very destabilizing nuclear arms race between US and China. Another reason that China has been very reluctant to join arms control discussions with the United States is that China doesn't know under what conditions it should join arms control talks. The entire nuclear build-up program is a result of Mr. Xi's preference to demonstrate a strategic power. And in recent years, the leadership has emphasized the importance of political loyalty within China. So other Chinese officials, especially lower-level officials and traditional Chinese nuclear experts, they no longer have the freedom to question the current decision-making of Mr. Xi. So internal discussions about what's the end goal of China's nuclear expansion when should China complete its expansion and join arms control negotiation, those discussions are not happening at all. The current Chinese rejection of arms control talks is also a result of China simply not knowing the answer about when China should join arms control. The American nuclear strategists and Western nuclear strategists, they are not necessarily aware of this internal decision-making dynamic in China. Instead, they are focusing on the potential military ambition of the Chinese nuclear program. The result of this is that the US could risk developing excessive military countermeasures that could further feed the Chinese perception of insecurity and lead China to invest more on additional nuclear weapons. In other words, there is a lack of understanding of how insecurity is also an important driver of the current Chinese nuclear expansion. The fact that China thinks it is facing a much more hostile United States, and therefore China needs to demonstrate power, that logic was not necessarily understood in Washington and other Western capitals. So the nuclear expansion and the subsequent nuclear competition is a symptom of the escalating political rivalry between the two sides. It's not only a military level problem, but so far the international community has not paid enough attention to the underlying political struggles that drive the nuclear arms race. At the regional level in Asia Pacific, there are many implications of China's current nuclear approach. China's nuclear expansion is providing cover for North Korea to also expand its nuclear capability very quickly. Because of China's own nuclear expansion, China is not in a good position to pressure North Korea to slow down North Korean nuclear development. And China is, in fact, increasingly providing political cover for North Korea to work on its nuclear and missile programs. And this has a very seriously negative impact on regional security dynamics and is causing countries like South Korea and Japan to develop growing interest in their indigenous strategic nuclear capability. Taiwan is also being affected by this nuclear dynamic. China is likely to use the nuclear shadow to constrain US conventional military options in the future Taiwan contingency. However, from the Chinese perspective, it's the United States who is more likely to threaten to escalate a future conventional war over Taiwan to the nuclear level because of the declining American conventional military superiority in the region. So China's nuclear policy over Taiwan contingency is mostly to deter an American threat of nuclear first use. But I think China will likely follow the Russian example of making nuclear signaling in a future war to put pressure on the United States and compel the United States to limit its military support to Taiwan. In terms of the role of civil society to help contain this nuclear escalation, so far there has been very little voice from China's civil society on the nuclear issue. Chinese civil society is being increasingly dismantled under Mr. Xi's policy to tighten domestic control. But there is still room, I think, for international civil society actors to enhance their outreach activities to their Chinese counterparts. One important area for engaging with China is to enhance communication with non-governmental experts and research organizations, and perhaps even Chinese media organizations, to really highlight the consequences of nuclear conflict. There is a very important research conducted by Princeton scholar Sebastian Philipp about and others about the nuclear fallout impact on China's own population in a nuclear exchange between US and China. Many Chinese public, Chinese people, they are not necessarily aware of how China's own nuclear buildup increases the risk of a future nuclear conflict, and how their own short-term and long-term interests, including health, etc., and economic prospect, might be affected by such a conflict. So I do think organizations like the International Coalition and others could make stronger efforts to talk to their counterparts in China and help raise the awareness, which in turn might indirectly affect Chinese expert community and Chinese leadership's thinking on the nuclear issue. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong Zhao. So our third speaker in the lineup is Timur Kadyshev, and Timur is a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg in Germany. And previously, he was a senior research scientist at the Center for Arms Control, Energy and Environmental Studies at Moscow for many, many years. And so, Timur, over to you.
Thank you, Zia. I should share my screen. Oh, yeah. You can see my screen now, right? So my presentation will be somewhat different from what you have just witnessed before. I will talk about Moscow perspective on the arms race, and my talk will consist of these parts. First, I will talk about New START compliance, New START treaty compliance. Then I'll talk about a little about Russia's nuclear doctrine, especially about its the part of it that deals with the use of nuclear weapons. Then we will discuss the implication of the war in Ukraine, Russian invasion against Ukraine, how Russian nuclear doctrine is affected by this war. That we'll talk about recent talks about revision of the doctrine, about enough weapons that President Putin recently decided to continue to start developing and producing, about nuclear spending, and I forgot about civil society. So, yeah, New START compliance. A few words about New START treaty to remind those who know about it, and probably for some of you to the new information. So it's the title of the treaty, the original title is Treaty on Measures for the Further Reduction and Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. It's in force since 2011, originally in 2021, and it was extended until 2026. And the most important central limits of this treaty are the 800 deployed and undeployed launchers, of which 700 deployed launchers, SABMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers equipped to carry nuclear weapons, and the limit on nuclear warheads, on deployed nuclear warheads, 1,550. Those include reentry vehicles and bombers, which are accounted as one for each bomber. In February of last year, Russia announced suspension of the treaty. What did they mean by it? The original idea was to indefinite suspension of inspections, so no inspections from them. Further, they stopped sharing the aggregate numbers. As a reason for this, President Putin complained about US development of new nuclear weapons. He also complained about French and UK nuclear forces not being accounted in the treaty. And eventually, Russia said that it will comply with the limit on the warheads, and also will continue identification on launches of missiles, according to the agreement from 1988. If you look at the actual numbers, and this is the most reliable source of the nuclear notebook, the numbers are from there, and we see that basically this year, if you count on deployed weapons, Russia still adheres to the limits of the treaty. Although the numbers, many of this, almost all the numbers are best estimates, and that's why we have we see that there is slight the number of warheads accounted according to New Start is slightly higher than the limit, but most probably it's because the numbers are approximate and the Russians still are below the limit. If you compare this to last year, and this was noted by CIPRI, for example, they apparently Russia has 36 weapons deployed more than in January of last year. And the reason for this is that most numbers are approximate and likely there is no increase, and Russia still is within the limits. So what's going on with the Russian arsenal? Russian arsenal used to be very old. Some of the missiles are dated back to 1980. So Russia continued to modernize its new personnel for like about 20 years now. And right now, what's going on is retirement and modernization of the strategic bomber force. So some of the 295s are retired and some are modernized, equipped with avionics, equipped with new pilots, new missiles. Modernization of the supersonic Tu-160 aircraft, and there are more new aircraft entering service. There is also ongoing development of IKDA perspective aircraft complex of the long-range aviation, but it's still in development. As for ICBMs, there is ongoing is the replacement of the older RS-12 missiles with the new RS-24ERs, both silo and mobile. There is also replacement of the old, basically SS-18s, Voyvoda, with the new RS-18 equipped with avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, and also with the new RS-28 Sarmat missile, the replacement basically of the heavy Voyvoda. And there is deployment of YARS-M, the modernization of ERs with more advanced mirror technology and further developments to more missiles. As for the sea-based ballistic missiles, there is an ongoing replacement of the older Delphin class submarines with the new Borei class, and also development of a new submarine. Also, the missiles are modernized. So, besides the modernization of the strategic force, in 2018, President Putin basically announced that Russia is developing as an asymmetric response to the United States ballistic missile defense, like 6 new weapons. Well, we have like 6 years, and then of those, Kinzhal, the air-launched ballistic missile, is deployed and actually used conventionally in conventionally armed ocean fleet in Ukraine. Sarmat, the new heavy ballistic missile, has been deployed. Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle is being deployed on ICBM boosters. Burevestnik is a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and it's all kinds of troubles in development and self-development. Poseidon, long-range nuclear-powered torpedo, also needs more work, and it's been tested 2 times in 2023, and one submarine is apparently reportedly equipped with 2 of them. And then there is Peresvet, which is compact laser complex, and it's basically a laser for blinding optical sensors, and it's apparently in service. And I said all of these things are being developed as an asymmetric response to United States ballistic missile defense. So let's turn to Russia's nuclear doctrine, and the most important part of it is the how does it define the conditions when nuclear weapons can be used. And in the doctrine that was adopted in 2014, there was like basically two conditions. It's either in response to nuclear weapons being used against Russia or its allies, or in the case of aggression against Russian Federation, conventional aggression, when on the threat is the very existence of the state. And this doctrine was actually well detailed in the basic principles of state policy on nuclear deterrence, which was signed by Putin in 2020. And it describes 4 conditions for the possibility of nuclear weapons used by Russian Federation. And well, there are many words, and you can read it, but I also made a short list of it. Basically, it's either attacking missile on Russia is detected, or, as the doctrine says, nuclear weapons are used. And attacking missile is basically the same, just only reason to have it separately is that an attacking missile is detected, you don't really know it's nuclear or not. So Russia says basically if there is an attacking missile, it's considered to be nuclear. And there is conventional attack on strategic nuclear assets, basically, which means that if such an attack takes place, Russia cannot retaliate. So if that's can happen, Russia will use nuclear forces in response. And then the familiar condition about the threat to the existence of the state. What's interesting was the 20th point of this state policy on nuclear deterrence, saying that the Russian president actually just need to inform that nuclear weapons were used or will be used. So if we look at the Ukrainian war, how does Russia try to use its nuclear doctrine, its military doctrine, to deter basically the West from helping Ukraine? In Vladimir Putin's address on the first day of invasion, he said that basically threatened the West that if they help Ukraine, then Russia will basically go on nuclear. If you read into this wording, the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. This is basically the threat of nuclear use. And why did it? He used this exact wording. Russia did not expect resistance from Ukraine on those first days. Troops were carrying parade uniforms. Riot police was advancing with troops. Like the reports like that Russian top military booked restaurants in Kiev to celebrate the victory. So apparently Putin was trying to threat against military interference. Or if you can guess better, tell me why he did that. Then in September of 22, when Russian invasion was not going very successful, they had to withdraw from part of Ukraine. And basically the situation was not very good to them. Russian President Putin said that if there is a threat to territorial integrity of our country, then we'll use nuclear weapons. Or if there is use of nuclear weapons against Russia, but that's not really a possible scenario. But in this second paragraph, he basically tried to say that driving Russia out of the occupied territory would be a threat to territorial integrity of the country. So he was trying to invoke that threat to existence clause of the doctrine, although there was no threat to internationally recognized Russian territory. So you see that and this is another example of July 2023, when there was when everyone expected that Ukraine will have a major counteroffensive that will be successful. So Medvedev, who is former president and now deputy chair of Security Council, said that if the Ukrainian forces offensive had progressed successfully and they had occupied part of Russian territory, Moscow would have been forced to use nuclear weapons. So he was trying again to invoke this clause of the threat to Russian state, basically, to stop Ukrainian offensive, basically stop the West from helping Ukraine with this offensive, which was not successful, as we know now. Then we have seen in two very separate occasions, Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov speaking on F-16s, which were promised to Ukraine by the West. And in July 2023, he said that the very fact of the appearance of such systems in the armed forces of Ukraine will be considered by us as a threat from the West in the nuclear sphere. And here he apparently was trying to invoke the either first or second clause of the nuclear policy, of the basics of Russian nuclear policy, in that if a missile is flying from F-16, it's going to be considered nuclear. So again, it was he was trying to stop. That was Russian idea of trying to stop the West from providing F-16, and then 1 year later, in May of this year, when F-16s are actually Ukraine is going to get them in summer, Minister Lavrov again says that F-16 fighters are part of the nuclear mission of NATO, and the use of them will be a signal for NATO that they're gonna nuclear. And apparently they should consider that Russia will invoke its nuclear doctrine and retaliate using nuclear weapons. Yeah, so but as we can see, all the threats did not make much impact on the help from the West. It's still coming, and it's coming more of it. So apparently, it looks like Russian top leadership was counting on the nuclear doctrine to actually deter the West in this conventional conflict. And there were talks about that Russia should or will revise its nuclear doctrine so that it answers the realities of the current situation. And apparently there was different ideas on how to do it, because eventually they had to go with two slightly different versions. One of those was Putin's June 20 statement that Russia needs to revision the doctrine because the West is developing, the United States is developing ultra low yield explosive nuclear devices, and that they have very low threshold of use and they will be used. So Russia has to pay attention to this and to react to this. And just a couple of days ago, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabkov said that we have to consider all the lessons of the what they call special military operation, the Ukraine war, and that Russia has to change nuclear doctrine so that because it has to change doctrine because it did not work, because it did not deter the West, basically. The most recent development in this nuclear arms race is that Putin on June 26, well, basically out of the blue, nobody was expecting this. He had the meeting of Security Council, which was online. He said that we need to consider further steps regarding a moratorium of the INF treaty weapons, basically medium and short range ground-based missiles. And he said that Russia needs to start producing this strike system and make decisions about where to put them. And this is apparently in response to the United States being having these weapons and deploying them in Philippines, for example. So this is I think that it was eventually would come, but not right now. But eventually this would come. It is also interesting to see that Russia Russian military, when the kind of treaty was still in force, they said that the treaty needs to be reconsidered, renegotiated, because Russia needs these weapons for other things, basically, to deter, for example, China. Of course, right now this is not the case. Russia is more like a junior partner of China, and probably doesn't want to deter them. But still, regarding nuclear spending, people expected that Russia would run out of money with this war and out of money for the nuclear weapons. But according to ICANN data, Russian military spending is growing. In 2023, there was like 24% increase in dollars. But since the ruble rate is worse now, and it was before, it's even more in rubles. And nevertheless, spending on nuclear weapons remains basically the same. It's slightly higher in rubles and slightly lower in dollars, but still Russia does have money on this and will spend. In part, this happens because Russia still has income from selling natural resources, and not only to Asian countries, but also even to Europe. So regarding civil society, that's an interesting question, and I talked about it together with Paul Podek at the ICTP conference in Trieste, and basically I can only stress again that Russia has very harsh laws that basically prohibits society from any unauthorized expressing any unauthorized opinions, even for calling war a war. People actually get jail time for stating the obvious truth. So there are probably there are ways to communicate among Russian scientists, among Russian activists, but this work cannot be done in Russia and will not affect Russian policy in any way. What it can do is work for the future. When the regime changes, then many things. When I say regime change, it doesn't mean that Russia becomes a beautiful Russia of the future. I mean, it's even if the basics of the regime is the same, but it becomes less oppressive and more open to outside world, then civil society will have a say in what would be the future of Russian military policy regarding nuclear weapons. And I'll stop here, and I hope you have heard me, because my voice is deteriorating for some reason. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you all. And I wanted to start our discussion by asking a question that I think is also of interest to some of the folks who sent in questions in advance. And that is that in her remarks, Sharon Weiner talked about the strong element of bipartisanship on nuclear policy in the United States, despite its otherwise competitive political system. And talking about Tong Zhao, he mentioned the fact that foreign policy, nuclear weapons policy, is basically dictated by Xi Jinping and a particular notion of the role of nuclear weapons in China's geopolitical situation. And Timur explained about how nuclear weapons fit into a particular context right now, about the failure of the Russian system to have its nuclear weapons shape the outcome that it wanted with the Ukraine war, despite all of the threats to use nuclear weapons and so on. So my question is that if you have bipartisanship driving US nuclear weapons policy, leadership driving nuclear weapons policy, or war and leadership driving nuclear policy, where do you see the possibility then for ending this dynamic of an arms race and the drive for increasing the role of nuclear weapons, increasing spending on nuclear weapons, or in the case of Russia, repeated threats to use nuclear weapons? So if we just kind of take the speakers in the order in which they spoke, so Sharon, Tong, and Timur, how do you see change coming to the situation that you described? Sharon, please.
So I suppose the convenient answer is inertia means nothing's going to change, right? At least in the US, if there's a bipartisan consensus that nuclear weapons provide security, I think the aftermath of Russia's war in Ukraine, and also whatever buildup China undertakes, there'll be a story that develops about that is consistent with deterrence and nuclear weapons. And part of the problem is that's because you can tell many stories about the role of nuclear weapons in security, because thankfully we've never really had to prove, and we can't prove what role they've played. So I think in that, though, comes the possibility for people to ask precisely that question. What role did US nuclear weapons play in deterring China's buildup? You could also make an argument, none. What role did they play in deterring Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Oh, not so good there either. And so I think if people are willing to look at the narratives that are developed in support of nuclear weapons and say, show me the evidence, because the exact opposite argument is also plausibly true. If we start demanding evidence to support the narrative about nuclear weapons and deterrence, I think that's the beginning for people being able to say, look, they were either irrelevant or they actually made the situation more dangerous. So in times when there's really heightened attention to these issues and heightened security concerns, I think that's the time that invites people to reconsider the role lots of things are assumed to play and to start to ask questions about those things.
Thank you. Tom?
I think fundamentally, we need to hold all the nuclear weapon states governments accountable in their nuclear decision making. There is, nuclear consensus in the US nuclear policy community, but I think there is still room for independent research to question or challenge some of the assumptions, or at least to help introduce more nuances into the current debate. For example, I do think the current American policy community's understanding of why China is expanding its nuclear arsenal is not comprehensive and balanced. So there, and in China and Russia, how to ensure government accountability is even a more critical and a challenging issue. And here I mentioned the role for the international governments and civil society actors to put, keep strong pressure on the nuclear saber rattling behaviors of Russia and on China's very opaque nuclear expansion program. The fact that Putin continues making nuclear threats and China continues rejecting international calls for arms control talk is that they don't receive enough international pressure. And what I will conclude by also making this brief comment that the nuclear is only part of the problem. Again, underlying the nuclear competition is there these major powers increasing political rivalry and political discord. And the US, doesn't want to worry about why China is building up the nuclear weapons, because the US thinks that, China may have its own paranoia that which the US can do nothing to help address. So it's the pathology of China's authoritarian system that created this inherent incentive to arms race. So the US cannot control that part, so the US can only focus on building up its own deterrent. It's that thinking that dismisses the need to understand the enemy's thinking and to then draft countermeasures accordingly. But I would argue that there are things that we can do to better understand and better respond, and to reduce the counterproductive impact of rushing to a one-sided policy response.
Thank you. Timur.
How can we change this? The problem is that in Russia right now, the only person who makes decisions is Putin. And people who are close to him, they are trying to tell him what will please him. So basically the idea, if you want to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, if you want to reduce the arsenals, we need to basically make Putin happy about it. This is both funny and not funny, because if you want to make Putin happy about it, that means he receives whatever he wants without relying on nuclear weapons. And we don't want to give him what he wants. So pressure from the international community apparently will not work, because he always has allies who will tell him, who will agree with him. So probably we need to work with other countries, with China, with Iran, with North Korea. If everyone will, if international community altogether will, if you don't have anyone to turn to, maybe then he will think about it. But I'm not sure even if then. Sorry, I'm pessimistic about it.
No, thank you. So the second question that comes from questions posed in advance and from the audience has to do with the contest in the United States for the presidency and what that might mean for this arms race dynamic. We've talked about the bipartisan consensus in the United States, but we also know that leadership in the United States can make a difference. One recalls the leadership of President Obama versus the leadership of President Trump. And so the question for Sharon and for Tong and Timur is, what are the implications of a second Trump presidency for these various arms racing processes and dynamics that you've identified? Sharon, please.
So in many ways, I think in the United States, the easy answer is it doesn't really matter. Because of the strong consensus underpinning US nuclear policy, to have a significant change is going to require any president to have a bold move, basically, because if you're going to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, you're going to have to go against a bureaucracy that's headed in the opposite direction. Now, that said, I think both Trump and Biden actually are capable of doing such actions if they choose to do so, but I don't see either of them making that choice. Perhaps the path forward and this may be a bit controversial for anyone who watched the US presidential debate, but to think about both of the people in that televised debate and to understand that unilaterally, either one could make an overture towards other countries about nuclear weapons and providing some checks on them. But perhaps most importantly, whichever one of those people is elected, they have the sole authority to launch US nuclear weapons without any oversight by anybody else. And at least for me, watching that debate, either one of those people in that capacity was terrifying. And to the extent that more Americans think about that, I think there's an opportunity for civil society to be more involved in demanding change, even if presidents don't support it or don't initiate it.
Thank you. So, Tong, do you think that Chinese leadership sees the change in leadership in the United States, or the possible change in leadership in the United States, as a factor in how it thinks about its way and the role of nuclear weapons in global affairs in the way that you described?
Well, if we look at the recent history, yes, after Xi came to power in 2012, he already started pushing for expanding Chinese nuclear weapons, but it's under Trump administration, especially in the 2020 and 21 timeframe. That's when China really developed a perception of an existential threat from the United States, resulting from senior Trump officials' public narrative on driving a wedge between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, efforts hinting at threatening China's, delegitimizing China's regime and threatening China's regime security. So what if Trump is reelected, and if he introduces again dramatic policies that could be viewed by China as aiming at destabilizing the Chinese regime, and I think that could further incentivize Chinese nuclear investment. Both previous Democratic and Republican administrations put pressure on China to join arms control, but it's under Trump administration that they threatened, they emphasized the use of coercive threats to compel China to the negotiating table, which didn't work. In comparison, the current Biden administration's policy of proposing concrete suggestions and models, launch notification measures, etc., made some progress. Given the challenge, it's hard to expect any real progress in either future administration, but it looks like the effort to talk with China, to appear to try to understand Chinese concerns and come up with concrete proposals, have a slightly better chance of incremental progress.
Thank you. Timur.
So, about Trump, I think that it was Alexei Arbatov who first made the observation that the worst relations are between the Soviet or Russian leadership and current US administration. The worse these relations, the better are the treaties that they concluded. And usually worse relations were with Republicans and best treaties were concluded with Democrats. But now the situation is rather different, because the relations with Democrats are pretty bad. Remember Obama, and now. While Trump, well, I wouldn't go as far as he is like Russian asset, although it certainly looks that way. He may actually, he has a thing for autocrats, and he probably will have very good relations with Putin. but that doesn't mean that he will be able to conclude good treaty, good agreement with Putin regarding nuclear weapons or anything else. So I think that Trump's election would strengthen Putin's position in the world, in Russia and in the world. And the relations with the US will be well, but that will not lead to any improvements in the nuclear field. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. And so this last question is that all of you have mentioned in various ways the role of outside actors in shaping the space for changing policy, whether it's other countries, as Timur mentioned, or the international community, or civil society in the international community. So do each of you have any specific suggestions for how those kinds of external players might be able to become part of this conversation in the way that you're talking about? I mean, do you see this coming through the United Nations? Do you see it coming through the countries on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Do you see it as something coming from NATO allies pushing on the US, for example? Is it countries from the global south? I mean, what kinds of mechanisms do you see which might actually make a difference in the specific systems of decision-making that you've described? So, Sharon, please.
All of them, hopefully. I mean, the short answer is we don't know what will gain traction and build momentum for people to pay more attention to nuclear issues and demand change from their governments. Or to and I'll speak only here about the US, partially because I think if the US makes a change, it invites Russia and China to reciprocate. And I would invite Tong and Timur to respond whether or not they would reciprocate. But we don't know what will cause that movement. But what I think needs to happen is for people who see themselves as a community of scientists, a community of people concerned about the climate, a community of people concerned about compensation for past dangers, whatever community people are in, irrespective of whether or not it crosses national lines, to realize that if nuclear weapons are ever used, they don't respect national boundaries either, and that every person on the planet has a stake in avoiding this. And the question is, what people do you want to engage with to voice your stake in this? If the US isn't going to move on nuclear weapons issues, perhaps it's the Europeans who need to pressure the United States to say, well, wait a minute, the chances are good that we might actually experience something bad here sooner than you will, or it will be different, or we have different things at stake. Any group of people that can call into question the narrative about the connection between nuclear weapons deterrence and security, I think is a good one and a useful one that's helpful, because for too long, US nuclear strategy for structure has labored under the assumption that deterrence unquestionably provides security. And I think calling that into question or pointing out what everyone has into stake, if that equation is wrong, is only helpful.
Thank you. Tong?
I think there are specific institutes in China with which civil society actors could reach out to see if there is possibility for dialogue and exchanges. The PLA Chemical Defense College, for example, is responsible for conducting research on nuclear fallout. And CACDA and other organizations like the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament are supposedly responsible for international discussions on peace and disarmament issues. Government organizations like CACDA, Arms Control Association, and the Chinese MFA Disarmament Arms Control Department, and Chinese delegations to Geneva and Vienna, they, I think the point is regardless of Chinese reception, international community should make a comprehensive effort to reach out, to let all the relevant Chinese agencies know that this is something the international community cares about, and China needs to respond to this pressure. I think regional countries in Asia Pacific, since they will be the direct victim of any nuclear exchange between US-China, even a limited nuclear exchange could produce fallout that affect these countries' public health and environmental integrity. Such countries can certainly work together to preemptively clarify the costs and consequences for nuclear weapon states to fight a nuclear war that would affect other neighboring countries. How, to make nuclear weapon states answer basic questions like how are they prepared to compensate other victim countries for being affected? How are they going to deal with the pollution as a result of the nuclear use? I think to make these costs and consequences clear beforehand is something that can be done. Last thought is we also need to think about the fundamental problem. A key driver of regional arms race at both the conventional and the nuclear level is the pressure that countries feel they have to prepare according to worst case scenario thinking. And this is, again, a result of countries like China who do not rule out the use of force to change territorial status quo. I think there is a need for international community to promote the common sense principle that no one should keep the option open of using force to change territorial status quo, including over Taiwan and other places. China still rejects this common sense principle. I think this is where international pressure should be on to make the major powers commit to basic principles, which could really reduce the incentive for regional arms race at all levels.
Thank you. So, Timur, last word.
Well, I think that to go away from the considering worst case scenario is not an option, because that's how military thinking works. If you remove this, you don't have military. Well, back to the original idea of what we can do. Well, I think that looking at what Russia actually wants to be with nuclear weapons, Russia wants to be on par with equal to the United States, basically. So if you want to try to convince Russia to go down with the level of nuclear weapons, you have to go down first, or together. But United States should be willing to go down significantly. But that wouldn't be enough. You also have to work with the people that consider Russia as a ally, that consider Russia as an example of leadership in the world, as Global South, for example, or Africa. You have to work with them. You have to convince them to put pressure on Putin to say that they want a world free of nuclear weapons, and Putin can do that to basically please them. But also part of this can be in normal thinking. If you want someone to go get rid of the advantage, or get rid of the parity, you have to make yourself vulnerable, as Sharon said before. And that what United States should not do with Putin. If you make yourself vulnerable to Putin, he will use this advantage. There's no question about it. That's in his nature. That's how that's his modus operandi. Don't be vulnerable to Putin. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Timur. And so with that, let me thank all of our speakers for this conversation today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us in this conversation. And a copy of the video of this webinar will be posted on the website of the Physicists Coalition. And you can review it there as you wish. And you can find more information about the coalition and resources, upcoming events, how to join. Young scientists can learn about the Next Generation Fellowship Program sponsored by the coalition to learn more about nuclear weapons issues. And you can learn about advocacy options and actions that you can take through the coalition as a member. All of that information is available on the coalition website. And well, thank you all for joining us today. And please keep your eyes open for future events by the Physicists Coalition. And if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share, please contact us at the Physicists Coalition, and we'd be happy to continue this conversation with you. So thank you, everyone.